All right, let's talk about angiosperms, the flowering plants. So the angiosperms are characterized by two new evolutionary innovations that only occur in angiosperms. This phylum is, so even though it's a phylum, it's over 200,000 species are in this phylum, as contrasting with the ginkgo phylum, which only has a single species. We have almost 300,000 Anthophyta. All angiosperms have flowers and fruit. Flowers aren't always showy. If the flowers of a particular angiosperm are large, colorful, showy, that means they're attracting a pollinator. They're trying to attract usually an animal of some kind. Bees, hummingbirds, even bats pollinate. And all angiosperms have fruit. The fruits aren't always edible by any animal. Their nuts are dry fruits. Their burrs are fruits. Some fruits are designed to dry and open up and allow the seeds to blow in the wind. But the fruit is whatever the ovary turns into in the flower. So here's our angiosperm flower. So we have petals here, and sepals are the leaves that surround the petals. And then we have female parts and male parts in the plant. So remember, this is our sporophyte, and the gametophytes are tiny in angiosperms. They're even more reduced than they are in the gymnosperms. They're only a few cells. So in the male gametophyte and the female gametophyte are each only a few cells. The female gametophyte is only 3 cells. So for the female parts of the plant, this is the ovary, this whole structure that's going to eventually have the seeds inside of it. And the ovary is what turns into the fruit, whatever it is, whether that fruit is going to be an apple or whether that fruit is going to be a nut or a burr that's going to stick to your dog's fur. That's the ovary. And then there's a structure called the style, which could be long like it is here in this lily, and it could be short. But the important part here is the stigma. So the stigma is a sticky surface that the pollen sticks to, and then the pollen tube is going to, that's pollination, and then the pollen tube is going to extend down into the ovary, into the ovule. The ovule, one ovule will form one seed. One ovary might have many seeds in it, but one ovule is only going to have one seed in it. For the male parts of the plant, the words that are important are the anther. Inside the anther, that is where the microspores are that are going to become the pollen grains. Flowers can be radially symmetric or bilaterally symmetric. So radially symmetric means they're the same no matter which way you turn them, but many flowers are bilaterally symmetric, like orchid flowers or snapdragons. And that's because having a bilaterally symmetric flower helps the flower to direct the pollinator to go in the right way to get dusted with pollen. Because plants, many species of angiosperms use animals like insects to transport their pollen to other flowers. Other angiosperms are wind pollinated, and those are ones that don't have showy flowers, like oak trees and maple trees. You probably never even notice that they have flowers because they're wind pollinated and they don't want pollinators. So they don't have a showy flower to attract a pollinator to move the pollen. Instead, they produce massive quantities of pollen that is distributed in the wind. Pine trees as well. Pine trees produce massive amounts of pollen because they're wind pollinated. Grasses too are wind pollinated. They produce enormous amounts of pollen because they're not attracting a pollinator. Plants that make showy flowers to attract a pollinator, they don't have to produce as much pollen because they're going to have it taken from flower to flower by an animal of some kind. Fruits are what forms from the ovary, and they vary quite a bit. And normally, and here's another case where the term that we use in everyday speech, in science, that word has a different meaning. So fruit in botany refers to whatever the ovary forms. whether it's something that we would recognize, like a tomato, and tomatoes are fruits, cucumbers are fruits because they have the seeds inside. If any edible plant has seeds in it, it's a fruit. A watermelon is a fruit, a lemon is a fruit. Anything that has the seeds, that's what the ovary of the plant formed, that's the fruit. Nuts are also fruits because that's what the ovary forms. Often for the nuts that we eat, there was something on the outside of that nut that's been removed during processing. Like if you've ever had lived somewhere where there was a walnut tree in the yard, when the walnut is on the tree, it looks like a tennis ball. It's green, it's quite large, and there's this fleshy fruit that surrounds the actual walnut shell that we're used to seeing in the grocery store. So a lot of nuts have that. What we see as the nut isn't actually the entire fruit, it's only part of the fruit. This is from a milkweed. This is one of the plants that I brought into lab. And the milkweed fruit is a dry fruit, and it releases its seeds with these little umbrellas of hairs, and they are designed to be dispersed by the wind. Other seed pods explode and broadcast the seeds. Some have little hairs like the milkweed seeds, or in this case, these are from a maple tree. Maple trees have these little wings to help the seeds to flutter away from the tree. We used to call these helicopters when I was a kid. We used to throw them, but they're actually maple seeds. Some seeds are designed to be eaten. So berries, raspberries, blackberries, strawberries, the seeds are intended to be swallowed by animals. They are perfectly able to survive the digestive tracts of animals, and then they can germinate after they get pooped out. So if you're eating raspberries, those seeds are just fine once they pass through your digestive system. Burrs are fruits that are dry, and they are designed to be carried by animals on their fur. And if you've ever taken your dog to a field or a dog park, you are very familiar with burrs. We have quite a few species of plants around here that produce, the fruit they produce is a burr of some sort that sticks to the dog's fur. And it would do the same with a wild animal. So the life cycle of the angiosperms is very similar to the gymnosperms, except the gametophyte is even more reduced in the number of cells. So the male gametophyte is only a few cells, usually 3 cells, and the female gametophyte as well is reduced to only 3 cells. So this shows the male gametophyte, and one of the cells in the pollen grain is the actual sperm cell that's going to fertilize the egg. Usually there are 2 cells. One fertilizes the egg, and the other sperm nucleus fertilizes another cell in the female gametophyte that's going to form the supportive tissue in the seed. And then there's another nucleus that's the one that's generating the tube, the pollen tube, that's going to allow the sperm nucleus to get to the egg. So this is the little pollen grain. It lands on the stigma, and once it's landed on the stigma, then the pollen tube forms and goes down into the ovary and into the ovule, and then the sperm nucleus can fertilize the egg. So here we have inside of the ovule, we have just 3 cells here that are the female gametophyte, and then we have a few diploid support cells here. And this egg cell, this is going to be fertilized by one of the pollen nuclei, and that's going to be our zygote. So here's our new diploid sporophyte zygote. That's what's going to divide and form the new little embryo. And then another cell, another sperm nuclei is going to fertilize one of the polar cells from the meiosis that produce this egg cell, and the female gametophyte cells, And then we're going to end up with a triploid tissue here, the endosperm, and that's going to provide the nourishment for this little sporophyte, our little diploid sporophyte embryo that's going to be inside the seed. So here's another little view of that. So this is a lily, and we like to use the lily a lot as an example. You'll notice that we use the lily a lot for very many examples in botany, and that's because it's it has a very simple kind of reproduction, and so we can generalize from there to all angiosperms. So here we have our ovule. We have our two polar nuclei, these are haploid nuclei, and our egg nucleus, which is also a haploid cell. So that's our female gametophyte. Those three cells are the female gametophyte. And then here's our pollen tube bringing the two sperm nuclei. One of them is going to fertilize the egg. One of them is going to fuse with these polar nuclei and form the endosperm. The endosperm is going to form the nutrient tissue that is going to feed that little plant embryo. And so now here we have our little embryo starts to divide. It forms one or two leaves. These first two leaves, these are called the cotyledons, and that's where we get the term monocot and dicot. This plant is a dicot because di means two, and it has two cotyledons in the embryo, so it's a dicot. If it's a monocot, that means there's only one leaf that forms here initially. And we used to think that all plants were either monocots or dicots, but as you'll see, it's gotten more complicated. So here's that life cycle again. Here's our ovary, where we have our megaspore, which is going to divide and only form 3 cells, and that's our female gametophyte. So here's our, don't worry about this word. See, we have excess vocabulary here. Synergids, I'm not going to ask you for that. I'm not going to ask you for this word, the antipodal cells. But we do have our 2 haploid nuclei here and our 1 egg nucleus. Those are the 3 cells that are the female gametophyte. And that the egg nucleus is going to be fertilized, and these polar nuclei are also going to fuse with 1 sperm nucleus. So here's our anther, and meiosis also occurs in here in the microspore. And then we're going to get our pollen grain from that. And our pollen grain as well is only going to have usually 3 cells, 2 sperm nuclei and a tube cell. And one of the sperm nuclei is going to fertilize the egg, and 1 sperm nucleus is going to fuse with to make the endosperm, and 1 nucleus is the tube cell. And that nucleus, that just serves to produce this pollen tube that's going to allow the other nuclei to get to the egg. And then we have our little embryo forming, our little diploid sporophyte embryo, and it's going to be surrounded by this triploid endosperm that's going to have nutrients, typically starches, fatty acids, a little bit of protein. That's typically what the endosperm contains. That's why for plants, if we're going to extract oil from a plant, we usually get it from the seed, because that the fatty acids in here are food for the plant embryo. It's also usually the most toxic part of the plant as well, is the seed, because the plant does not want you to eat the seed. Let's watch the video.
The function of flowering is to produce seeds and disperse them to locations where the young plants are likely to survive. At each step, there is an emphasis on protecting the offspring. This activity reviews some of the most important steps. Events in seed formation begin with pollination, in which wind or animals bring pollen to the flower. The growth of pollen tubes caused the flower to discard its colorful parts, petals and stamen. After pollen arrives, the bright petals are a hazard. They attract animals that might eat the delicate young fruit. We've enlarged the ovary and sliced it open. An ovary contains one or more ovules that will become seeds if they are fertilized. One ovule is shown here, with the front removed to reveal its parts. The ovule is attached to the ovary wall by a stalk that provides nutrients. Starting from a pollen grain at the stigma, which is not shown, a pollen tube grows down through the carpel to the ovule. It carries 2 sperm that enter the ovule. One sperm fuses with the egg cell to make a zygote, which is the first cell of the embryo. The other sperm fuses with the 2 nuclei in the central cell, making a triploid nucleus. The triploid cell will grow and divide to make a food-storing tissue, the endosperm.
Here's a second little video.
This ovule has been fertilized and will become a seed. Each of its cells contains one or more sets of chromosomes, but the number of sets of chromosomes differs among the parts of the ovule. Double fertilization converts the large central cell from diploid to triploid, while the egg becomes a diploid zygote. The surrounding integuments remain diploid as they were before fertilization. The embryo is a young plant that grows from the zygote, while the large central cell grows into food-storing endosperm. All this is enclosed within a protective seed coat that grows from the integuments around the ovule.
Taking food through its stalk, the developing seed expands its endosperm and embryo. When the embryo is mature and dormant, the integuments develop into a protective seed coat and detach from the ovary wall.
The main axis of the embryo has a root apex and a short stem that may have a few tiny leaves, not shown here, near the shoot apex. The cotyledons are part of the embryo. They're the first leaves. Monocots have 1 cotyledon. Eudicots have 2.
So angiosperms are more complicated than were first thought like 30, 40 years ago. It used to be thought that all angiosperms could be neatly divided into monocots and dicots. And of course, like everything in biology, it turned out to be much more complicated than that. And DNA has really been the key to figuring out how angiosperms are actually related to each other. There are some very primitive angiosperms in the fossil record from about 305 million years ago. So this is about 50 million years after the first gymnosperms appear, but still well before the dinosaurs. Gymnosperms remained dominant over angiosperms, though, for a long time. And angiosperms really didn't start to dominate the landscape until partway through the age of the dinosaurs. We now consider this Ambarella to be the most primitive angiosperm. It's just a single species that lives on this remote island called New Caledonia. But we now also know that the family that includes water lilies and also star anise are not dicots, but in fact are more primitive lineages. And this is the way we divide it now. So here's the gymnosperms down here, and then here's this extinct group, which is considered a very primitive flowering plant. And then the living angiosperms. And we used to divide, see, here's the monocots, so only having 1 cotyledon. That includes like grasses and corn and stuff. And then the true dicots, where's my pointer? U means true or good. So the eudicots are the new name for the dicots. We used to just have monocots and everything else was a dicot because they do have 2 cotyledons in the embryo. So these ones in red here, they do have 2 cotyledons in the embryo. However, we can't have dicots and monocots because, as you can see, that would be a very unfortunate clade and it would not be monophyletic. So it's been divided up. And so now we have these more primitive groups are not included in the dicots anymore, with Ambarella, water lilies, and star anise being quite early branches in the evolution of angiosperms. The magnoliids, which includes, you know, the common magnolia that you've heard of, the one that they make perfume out of and stuff, that's a more recent branch. And then monocots are an even more recent branch. So all of these, except for the monocots, are dicots, really. But we don't have that grouping anymore of dicots because it would be a paraphyletic group that did not include, and it wouldn't represent well the actual evolution. And these, you know, that's the thing with phylogeny. Our trees should represent what has occurred during the course of evolution. So the new tree more accurately represents that. So here's some of those basal angiosperms. So Ambarella is a woody shrub-like plant with these very simple flowers. It's only found in one place in the world. There used to be more species of it, we assume, and it used to be more abundant. New Caledonia is a really interesting place. It's an old island. It's not one of these recent volcanic islands like the Galapagos. It's a continental remnant, so it's old, and it has many species that are old remnants of various groups and are found nowhere else. Botanists love to go there for vacation because there's so many weird plants there. Water lilies as well are considered very primitive and are an early branch of the angiosperms, as well as, you know, this is if the star anise, this is native to Vietnam and is used extensively in cooking. The little brown kind of star-shaped spice that you can buy is from this plant. Magnoliids are the more recent branch, so this is a newer group than those other three groups. And there's several thousand species. Many of them are kind of woody shrubs or even trees. There are magnolias that are not huge trees, but kind of medium-sized trees. But they're the most closely related. They were the last branch before the monocots and the eudicots separated. So the eudicots and the monocots have some characteristics that identify them that we can use. So if we eliminate all those primitive plants that are actually, they do sort of fall with dicots, but they have a mixture of characters from these two types. So it was always a problem where to group those plants because they didn't neatly fit into one of these two categories. So it's so much better now. Okay, so the monocots have a single cotyledon in the embryo. The leaf veins tend to be parallel. So think of like corn or a lily or an orchid. If you look at a cross section of the stem, the vascular tissue is kind of all over the place. Roots as well tend to be kind of dispersed and all over the place. Pollen grains have one opening. You'd need a microscope to determine that. And the flower organs usually are multiples of 3, so 3 or 6 anthers, etc. Eudicots, 2 cotyledons in the embryo. Leaf veins are usually more net-like. Vascular tissue is arranged in a ring, and you should be able to see these in lab. We have some slides of corn root, which is the zea, and then we have buttercup root, which is a eudicot. There's a taproot usually, and if you've ever pulled dandelions, you know that they have a long taproot. They're definitely eudicots. Pollen grains tend to have 3 openings, and the flowers tend to have multiples of 4 or 5 for the sepals, petals, anthers, etc. So some monocots, orchids are monocots. All of the grasses, which would include corn, is a monocot. Wheat, barley, rice, these are all the grains. These are all monocots. The only trees that are monocots, so most monocots are small, herbaceous plants. The only trees are the palm trees. And you can tell by the way palm trees grow that they are not like other trees. They they grow, they're kind of like a giant piece of grass, the way palm trees grow, with these leaves that come out from a central stem, and they don't have the complex branching patterns that dicot trees have. We get one seasoning from an orchid, or flavoring, I should say. Real vanilla is from an orchid, a vanilla orchid. Eudicots, the entire legume family, so all the beans, including soy, those are eudicots. Roses are eudicots. Most of our trees, so maples and oaks are, and all of those kind of trees are eudicots as well. They're 2/3 of the flowering plants are eudicots. So all the rest of those, the monocots and all of those more primitive flowering plants, they're only 1/3 of all of the flowering plants. 2/3 of them are eudicots. We get a lot of our food from flowering plants. In fact, most of our food, unless you're eating pine nuts or something, most of our food comes from angiosperms. So all the grains, potatoes, are all from flowering plants. We have been using genetic selection, just selecting plants for their qualities for about 10,000 years, and we've created enormous genetic change in these plants just through selection, artificial selection. Only very recently have we actually been using direct DNA manipulation. Some of our other edibles that are from flowering plants include coffee and cocoa. Most of the wood that we burn is also from these plants, and many medicines as well are also from these plants. We don't get a whole lot from any of the other plants, and that could possibly be just because angiosperms are so common and so dominant. Most of the species of plants on Earth are angiosperms right now, and most of the rest are gymnosperms. So that's where most of our plant foods are going to come from. So here again are the 5 derived traits of seed plants compared to our seedless plants that we studied in chapter 29. So vastly reduced gametophytes. The gametophytes are totally dependent. In angiosperms, the gametophytes are reduced to just 3 cells. The male and the female gametophytes are just 3 cells. Heterospory, so the spores that give rise to the gametophyte are, if the microspores give rise to the male gametophyte and the pollen grain, megaspore give rise to the female gametophyte and the egg. The ovules are inside the ovary, and the ovary produces the fruit in angiosperms, but the ovule itself is going to be the seed in both gymnosperms and angiosperms. So gymnosperms are the naked seed because we just have the ovule, there's no fruit. The ovule is going to be the seed. And that's true, the ovule is going to be the seed in angiosperms as well. The pollen is the male gametophyte, and the big evolutionary advantage for pollen over having a flagellated sperm is that you don't need water for fertilization. So fertilization can occur in really dry conditions. Liverworts and ferns, if there isn't enough water, at least to have a film of water on the surface of the plant, fertilization cannot occur. With pollen, it can be dry. You don't need rain in order for fertilization to occur because there's no swimming sperm. Seeds also provide an extremely durable protective coat on the little embryo. So unlike the seedless plants where the growing new sporophyte is completely dependent on a living, growing gametophyte, in this case it is not. And in fact, the sporophyte is going to be, it's inside this seed, and the nutrients are being supplied by the gametophyte tissue that was there before. So it doesn't need a living, growing plant. It has stored nutrients in it from the sporophyte and the gametophyte. Okay, so that's it for plant diversity, and we will see you in the next video.